Imagine knowing that there's a giant mirror floating in space above Earth. I know it sounds like something out of a science fiction movie, but what you're seeing is a real image of one of the most bizarre and fascinating objects humanity has ever launched into space. And look, this story isn't just about a giant mirror orbiting our planet. It's about a not-so-secret Russian plan that could have completely changed the way we live on planet Earth. But before I tell you about this crazy Russian project, you need to know that the idea of using giant mirrors as weapons isn't new. In fact, this story began over 2,000 years ago with a guy you've probably heard of, Archimedes. There's a legend that says Archimedes, that Greek genius who discovered the principle of buoyancy, would have created giant mirrors to set fire to the Roman fleet that was besieging his hometown of Syracuse. The story goes that he used concave mirrors to concentrate sunlight and literally burn enemy ships. Archimedes died in that battle, so the legend probably isn't true. But let's admit, it would be an epic way to exit the scene. Now, jump to 1929. A German physicist named Hermann Oberth developed plans for an orbital space station equipped with a concave mirror 328 feet in diameter. The idea was to reflect sunlight to a concentrated point on Earth. And you already know where this story is going, don't you? During World War II, Nazi scientists took this idea and transformed it into something much more sinister. The Sonnengewehr, literally the sun weapon. The updated plan was to deploy a giant space station 54,800 miles above Earth's surface. This station would have an enormous reflector made of metallic sodium, covering an area of 3.5 square miles. The Nazis claimed that the Sonnengewehr would produce concentrated heat sufficient to incinerate an entire city or boil the water in lakes and rivers. In July 1945, Life magazine published an article illustrating this entire crazy plan. But even journalists in the 1940s could figure out that even if the Germans put a giant mirror in space, it wouldn't create a real death ray. The concentrated heating effect of reflected sunlight only works at short focal distances, like when you use a magnifying glass to fry an ant. When you try to do the same thing from space, you just end up projecting a giant circle of light on Earth's surface that wouldn't be hot enough to cause damage. So that's one less concern we have in life. But if you can't use a space mirror to create a giant death ray, then what would you use such a thing for? And this is where the father of the modern space mirror comes in, Vladimir Syromyatnikov. Vladimir was a Russian engineer born in 1933. He grew up in a turbulent world under Joseph Stalin's control, an era of violence, political purges, and obsessive militarization of the Soviet Union. The only positive aspect of this time was a flourishing community of Soviet scientists and engineers who were tasked with developing the nation's nuclear weapons arsenal and space exploration rocket fleet. Vladimir excelled in the space race. He helped design and develop the Vostok, the world's first rudimentary spacecraft that would launch Yuri Gagarin into space in 1961. By the 1970s, he had risen to the top of the Soviet space program and was designing advanced spacecraft docking systems. He created the androgynous peripheral docking system that would link Soviet and American space capsules in the Apollo-Soyuz test flight, the first international cooperative space mission. His updated design of this system would later be used on the Russian Mir space station and would allow docking with the American space shuttle. Behind all this important work for the space program, Vladimir had a personal fascination with solar sails. The idea is that a large reflector can be used as a spacecraft propulsion method, capturing the pressure of solar radiation to travel deep into the solar system without having to burn fuel. Soviet leadership wasn't very impressed with the idea. By the 1990s, the space race was over, and the USSR was in the midst of total collapse. If government money was going to be spent funding an engineering project, it would need to demonstrate some kind of economic advantage. So Vladimir reframes his solar sail into a new idea that would revolutionize economic productivity in northern Russia and beyond. The issue with the world's northernmost regions, those places near or above the Arctic Circle, is that they experience a very unusual day and night cycle thanks to Earth's axial tilt. At the height of summer months, the sun never really sets, but on the other hand, at the height of winter darkness, the sun never really rises. This prolonged period of winter darkness makes it almost impossible to do much and requires a large amount of energy to keep lights on and heaters running. Not that there are many humans living in these high northern latitudes, but a significant portion of the Arctic landmass belongs to Russia, and there are many Russians who live and work up there. So Vladimir has an idea. Instead of using a giant reflector in space as a sail, it could be used as a reflector. It could then redirect sunlight in space to a city in northern Russia living in prolonged darkness. Just imagine the increase in economic productivity that these northern regions would experience if a space mirror could be used to simply turn the sun back on. Not only would this drastically reduce the cost of electric lighting and heating fuel, thinking even bigger, an entire chain of these reflective satellites could be placed in a sun-synchronous orbit so that all would remain in a constant position above Russia, and all could simply transmit sunlight 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It would be daylight all night long. Not surprisingly, this perpetual economic machine was much better received than the deep space exploration thing. Vladimir didn't need government support anymore. Private investors were pouring money into the giant space mirror project that would become known as Znamya, which translates to banner in Russian.
The first prototype was built as a ground test model. It wasn't sent to space. It was just an exercise to perfect the design for Znamya 2. The plan was to gradually increase the size of their space mirror designs. Znamya 2 would have a 66-foot diameter, followed by version 2.5 with 82 feet, then V3 with 230 feet. This would culminate with a permanent installation reaching 656 feet in diameter. There would be between 24 and 36 of these giant mirrors traveling in a north-inclined orbit. The altitude would be set as low as 621 miles or as high as 3,728 miles. Each reflector could illuminate an area on its own, or multiple ones could be focused on the same area for greater brightness. It was believed that full-size Znamya would produce light 50 times brighter than the full moon and illuminate a surface area between 37 and 56 miles in diameter. On October 27, 1992, the first space mirror in history was launched aboard a Progress spacecraft from Baikonur Cosmodrome. The autonomous spacecraft would then dock with the Mir station, where crew members would place an 88-pound drum containing the folded reflector in the Progress docking port. The Progress would then depart from the station and move to a position about 492 feet away. An electric motor inside the drum would start spinning and unfold the 8-segment reflector disc. The circular shape was maintained by the drum's rotation, and the position was controlled by Progress maneuvering thrusters. On the morning of February 4, 1993, Znamya 2 would produce a 3.1-mile-wide light beam that traveled over Earth's surface from southern France to western Russia. The bright circle traveled at an estimated speed of 5 miles per second and had brightness equivalent to a full moon. So anyone witnessing this from the ground would have seen something more like a quick flash than a giant light beam. And almost no one even saw the flash because much of Europe was covered by thick clouds that morning. The mirror was deorbited after several hours and burned up in the atmosphere over Canada. It was far from being the most impressive technical demonstration, but Znamya 2 was always just the first step in a long line of Russian space mirrors. It would take until 1999 for Znamya 2.5 to be ready, but it flew to space on February 5, with an 82-foot diameter reflector that would be able to project a 4.3-mile-wide bright spot on Earth with brightness equivalent to between 5 and 10 full moons. The goal of this demonstration would be to keep the spotlight in a fixed position for several minutes at a time. Unfortunately, shortly after deployment, during the mirror unfolding process, the ultra-thin mylar film got caught on a Progress spacecraft antenna and caused a tear in the material. Ground operators tried to free the tangled mirror, but Znamya 2.5 was declared a failure, and the whole thing fell helplessly back to Earth and incinerated. This catastrophic failure was enough to kill the entire Znamya project. Version 3 was never built, and Vladimir died a few years later in 2006. Since then, Earth's people have never launched a giant mirror into space again, probably because it's not really a particularly useful thing to have. It can't be used as a death ray, and it's highly questionable to think there would be any substantial benefit to any living thing from having perpetual sunlight. You'd almost certainly cause more harm than good. But the 1990s were a wild time. You could get away with some strange things, like launching not one, but 2 giant mirrors into space, just to see what would happen. And you who made it this far, if you like this crazy story, comment, leave your like on the video, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to watch one of the suggested videos that's appearing on your screen. Thanks everyone. See you next time.